Hey, I'm super glad to be with you guys this morning. It's been kind of a crazy week, huh? Let me ask you guys a question. How many of you have ever felt like you had to hide how you felt about something? Like you felt the need to censor yourself and not share how you actually feel about a situation, right? I've had friends before where you can see them making some decisions that aren't the best, that aren't wise, and you're like, should I tell them how I really feel about that, or should I? No, I don't want to rock the boat, And so you kind of self-censor. You tell yourself it's for the sake of keeping the relationship good and not making them upset or offending them. But deep down, you don't agree, and you want to say something to them, and you want to be honest with them about how you feel about the way that they're acting. But then you feel like you kind of have to hide, and you don't share how you actually feel. I think many of us do this in our day-to-day life, but more importantly, I think many of us do this in our relationship with God. Especially, how many of you've grown up going to church? You've grown up at least somewhat connected to the story of Jesus and the gospel, and maybe for you, at least this is how I was when I was your age. I grew up in church, and I wanted to mean it, and I think I did mean it, but then I had a lot of times where I was like, do I know what it means to mean it? And it's tough, because there's a lot about our faith that is abstract. In other words, it's not tangible, where you can't touch, feel, see it the way that you can think or imagine it. And so that makes it difficult to bridge that gap between philosophical, up in the clouds, abstract, and reality, what's grounded in real life. And so that's tough, to take your faith from here and bring it down to here. And definitely doable. But when I was your age, I was figuring out how to do that. I was figuring out what that meant. And a lot of times that meant I had to hide kind of how I felt about God. And maybe some of you have felt that tension before. Maybe it's because you just question certain things about your faith based on what you hear in science class, or the realism aspect of it. Or maybe for you it's because you feel like maybe God doesn't care about how you feel. Maybe you feel like he's up there, but there's so many people, there's billions of people on the planet, he doesn't know and specifically care for you as an individual or know what you're going through. Or maybe you're just not even sure at all about any of it. Maybe you've gone through something really difficult in your life. Maybe you've experienced a hardship that has made you really question the goodness of God. But wherever you are, I think there tends to be things in our lives that cause us to feel like we have to hide how we feel about God. Maybe it's sin. Maybe we've done something that we know is wrong, and because of that, we feel like we can't be real with God about ourselves because we know he truly sees us, but we can't really admit to our own faults because he's God, and that feels shameful. But for whatever the reason, instead of being honest about what we feel, we choose to hide. We choose to hide in our fears, in our anxieties, in maybe our poor choices, but we pretend we're fine, really good, don't we? We pretend that we have it all together, and we choose to hide. I want to talk to you about a passage in Luke. Now, Luke was not a disciple of Jesus. He was not even a Jew. He was a Gentile. He was a non-Jew. He was a physician or a doctor, and he actually went and wrote down the account of his gospel based on his investigative work. And he traveled with the disciples. He interviewed them. He wrote down their stories, and it's really cool to kind of glean his perspective and how he writes in a lot of ways. But we're going to look at an experience that Jesus had. It has a lot to do with what I was just talking about sharing kind of our feelings or hiding how we feel. And Jesus, he was with his disciples, and he knew what was about to happen. He knew that he was about to be arrested, convicted falsely, put to death, and then ultimately raised from the dead. He knew all that was about to happen. His disciples were clueless. But Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is praying right before this happens, right? We talked about this a little bit last week. He told his disciples, to keep watch and pray, and what did they do? They fell asleep, right? He said, bless you. He said, he said, keep watching, pray for me. And they fell asleep. Last week we talked about how he prayed for unity amongst the believers, for you and me. That we would be united, so to show the world that his love is real. But there's more to that prayer that we didn't cover last week that we're going to cover this week. And as Jesus is praying, this is what Luke records in his gospel. Jesus says, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done and not mine. Not at all kind of like what I would expect when I picture Jesus. When I picture Jesus, especially in this moment, I think, well, this is what he came to earth to do, to die for our sins. So he's probably putting on his superhero cape and he's like, come kiss me, Judas. I'm going to go be betrayed and die for everybody. But he wasn't. He was like, God, if there's any way that you can, solve this whole sin issue without me going through all of this, please do it. Please take this cup of suffering away from me. But ultimately, what's the second half of that prayer? Yet I want your will to be done and not mine. That's a tough prayer to pray. Because it means, God, even if you don't answer my prayer, I acknowledge you're still the man. You're still in charge. You still have good plans. And I'll trust in your good plans even when they don't seem so good to me. And so Jesus accepts the cup of suffering, walks to that cross, and dies a shameful death for you and I. And then he rises from the dead. And that's what we're going to celebrate next weekend at Easter. But it's important to note that even Jesus went through things he didn't want to go through. And it wasn't taken as a sign that God didn't care. It wasn't taken as a sign that God doesn't see. It doesn't take away the reality that God is with him and with us. I think Jesus probably felt all kinds of emotions in this moment. In fact, as we continue to read, Luke wrote that Jesus prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground. Like, have you ever been so nervous you're like sweating? Like, imagine that. Like, one of the other translations, it says his sweat was like drops of blood, right? It's like meaning like he was sweating so profusely. Some people have analyzed that text and thought like there is a physiological condition where sweat does turn to blood. And there's been lots of debate in the scholar world about the reality of that happening in this moment or not. But the reality is true that Jesus was under a tremendous amount of pressure and a tremendous amount of stress and a tremendous amount of anxiety and wanted God to not make him go through this. But when it came down to it, Jesus walked in God's will. He didn't hide his own feelings. He didn't hide what he wanted to happen. But at the end of the day, he sucked it up no matter what his feelings were, and he did fulfill God's will. And I want you to recognize that this moment is so crucial in the way that we see God. It has crucial impacts on the way that we then live out our faith, to know that yet not my will, but yours be done. It doesn't matter if it's good to me, I know it's good to you. Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that he works all things for the good of those who love him. Jesus promises in this world we will have trouble, but he also promises he is with us to the very end of the age. So we have nothing to be afraid of. Here's what I think we can do. We can trust in that good plan. We can trust that God knows best. Part of trusting God is being honest with him, to process how we feel, to process and truly understand that he is with us. And part of trusting God is being honest with him. So 2 things for you to do. 1, I want you to be real with God. Don't shy away from it. Don't shy away from your fears, your feelings, your doubts. Own them and bring them to him. Otherwise, they will grow inside of you and they will turn you away from him eventually. So, be real, be honest, be authentic. If we're mad, if we're sad, if we don't understand, God can take it. He can handle our anger. He can handle our misunderstanding. He just wants us to be real. Secondly, choose to believe that he's with you no matter what. It is a choice to believe. You can see things through all kinds of lenses. You can choose to see the pain and suffering in the world as a sign that God isn't real and he doesn't care, or you can see it as an opportunity that he uses to further his kingdom, and you can be a part of it. And he works all things for good. Part of trusting God is being honest with him. So in a minute, you're going to go to your groups, and you're going to discuss maybe what's one thing in your life that you want to be honest with God about. But it's been kind of a crazy weekend, right? I know several people in our church, and probably a lot of you in this room, have been affected by the storms that happened the other night. And I don't want to gather here and not acknowledge that. I know you guys were praying a few minutes ago. I grew up in Joplin, Missouri. So if you don't know, there was a historic tornado that ripped through my hometown, and it was the week after I graduated high school. And a third of my town was blown away. Like, I didn't recognize it. People were displaced. I was without power for over a week. I think it was like a week and a half. I was going to parts of my town and not recognizing where I was because there were no landmarks anymore to recognize where you were. And so it's tough. I get that. But I'll never forget the way that our town unified and came together and cared for each other in the midst of that tough time. And what could have been used to turn people bitter towards God actually brought people together for his name and allowed the church to shine to take care of those in need. And it allowed the noise to dissipate long enough for people to actually listen for God's voice once again. God doesn't promise that we're going to be without trouble in this life, because this isn't heaven yet. But he does promise he's going to be with us in every storm, that he's going to be right there beside us, and that he's going to work all things for our good. If we trust him, if we're honest with him, if we depend on him over anything else that a storm could ever take away. He is good. He is just.